I'm a philosopher. That always elicits a huge round of applause when I say that, by the way. Thank you, thank you. What can I say? People love philosophy. The reason I mention that is because I'm going to start off with a why question, which is often associated with philosophers, right? In fact, I'm going to start off with a notorious one, often associated with philosophers, and that is, why are we here? No, really. Why are we here? Why are we here? Why do self-described skeptics get together to talk, meet other skeptics, listen to skeptic speakers, organize and plan events? In other words, why skepticism? That's a pretty broad topic. I only have, actually now, just about 25 minutes. So I'm going to try to make it a bit more concrete and zoom in and ask, why skeptic organizations? Because, it's one thing for people with like minds to get together and talk about their common interests. That happens all the time. But do we need skeptic organizations? And there are a lot of them. There are a lot of them throughout the world. There's one in the Czech Republic, we found out, right? There's some in Australia. Obviously, several local and regional organizations in the US. I'm sure many of you are members of them. And then we have a couple of national organizations, including, of course, CSI, the sponsor for this conference. Well, what does CSI do, other than organize this conference? Well, it publishes magazines, right? Publishes Skeptical Inquirer magazine, which is a great magazine. I hope if you're not a subscriber, you will become a subscriber. It has great articles in it, very informative. But a critic of skepticism, someone who's a cynic, might say, well, this is just another example of skeptics talking to themselves. And really what the magazine does is raise money for the organization so they can hire employees to put out the magazine, so the magazine can raise money for the organization, so that you get the idea, right? Now I have to say, this is what a cynic would say, not me, because I can see the blood draining from Ken Fraser's face already. And I don't want, But I'm raising this topic, actually, because I think we have to meet a criticism that has been launched by some people, but most notoriously a criticism that was launched at the Nexus conference this past spring. Some of you may have attended that. That's the Northeast Conference on Science and Skepticism. When I was originally planning this talk, I was going to focus entirely on CSI's efforts on public policy, which I'm still going to talk about. But then I heard about this talk by John Horgan, who is a fairly well-known science journalist. I think it's fair to say that his talk at Nexus, he launched into a blistering attack on skeptics and especially skeptic organizations, saying that really skeptics are just spending time talking to themselves and bashing what he called soft targets, such as ghosts, heaven, ESP, homeopathy, Bigfoot. So what about this? Is it true that we spend time focusing on these issues? Are they really soft targets? Well, like good skeptics, maybe we should start by looking at the evidence. And maybe we should look at how skeptics describe themselves. And maybe one place to start is looking at the mission statement of CSI. CSI says it promotes scientific inquiry, critical investigation, and the use of reason in examining controversial and extraordinary claims. I think another way to put that might be that skeptics are people interested in finding out the truth about things, are disinclined to accept the claim that X is true, unless that claim has been properly evaluated, especially if that claim deals with controversial or extraordinary issues. Now, the first two parts of that description are pretty self-explanatory. Obviously, the method we use is a scientific method, testing things under controlled conditions where possible. That's not possible. So we'll look at the alleged evidence for a claim using reason, critical thinking, and our accumulated storehouse of scientifically validated knowledge. But what about this focus on controversial or extraordinary claims? What's that mean exactly? And why do skeptics focus on that? Why don't we do other things? Well, maybe to state the obvious, CSI, and I think this is true of most of the skeptic community as a whole, we don't do basic scientific research, right? Scientists do that. Scientists associated with universities, scientists associated with the government, private enterprise, of course, because if you're a drug manufacturer, you have to test things to see if they work, unless you're a homeopathic manufacturer, then you don't have to do that, right? But CSI doesn't do that. We don't have the resources to do that. We leave that to the scientists. Now, we communicate through SI and conferences and blogs and what sort the results of basic science. And that's important because there's an abysmal lack of an understanding of science among the general public. But we focus on controversial and extraordinary claims. In fact, the picture up there of Joe Nickell is him emerging from a cave, or maybe that's his new office in Amherst. But in any event, he's one of the people we support in conducting investigations, but they're investigations, again, limited to controversial or extraordinary claims. So why do we do that? Why do we focus on that? Well, again, in part, it's resources, but it's also because these are the type of claims that many scientists aren't interested in, right? Because, in fact, when I say they're controversial, they're not necessarily controversial among scientists. Here's an example of some of the controversial issues where I think skeptics can play and have played a constructive and distinctive role. Homeopathy, acupuncture, I list there. All the other various forms of alternative medicine, you have Reiki, you have cupping, you have chiropractic practice, naturopathy, the list goes on and on. It's a very large area. Important influence on the public because a lot of people use those type of things. Evolution, GMOs, I could have listed vaccines, climate change. These are controversial issues. But when I say they're controversial, it doesn't mean they're controversial among scientists, right? Because most scientists understand that homeopathy isn't and can't be effective. They accept the fact of evolution. They know that GMOs are safe. I mean, every time you come up with a new, genetically engineered plant, you have to test it. But in general, the theory that just because something is genetically engineered, it might be unsafe, people recognize that's wrong. People accept the reality of climate change. And I think this is where Horgan made his mistake. He thinks that because a claim is not controversial among scientists, somehow that makes it a soft target. It's nice, soft, fluffy. What we're doing is like shooting cannons into clouds, right? It really has no effect. But that's wrong, because simply because something isn't controversial among scientists doesn't mean it's not controversial among the general public. And what we do at CSI, and what I think a lot of you do as skeptic activists, is try to make sure the public becomes aware of what science has revealed. I don't know if you were at Ken Fraser's talk last night. It was a wonderful talk. And I think at some point he used the phrase that CSI and the skeptic community in general is a bridge. It bridges the gap between science and the general public, what scientists do and what the general public understands. And one example of that, I think it's a good example because CSI has actually done a lot of work on this recently, is homeopathy. Now, again, in theory, homeopathy would seem like a soft target because anyone who's a scientist knows that, look, it violates the basic principles of chemistry and physics, right? It just can't work. I mean, apart from a placebo effect, right? It doesn't work. But nonetheless, there is a robust demand for homeopathy, especially in Europe. I don't know if anyone's ever traveled in Europe and gotten outside the tourist attractions and walked down some street where there are some pharmacies. You'll see these big signs in the window advertising homeopathic products. It's a huge thing in Europe, but it's also big in the United States. The annual market for homeopathic products in the U.S. is $3 to $4 billion. At least 5 million adults use homeopathic products annually. There are a number of trade associations associated with the homeopathic industry. Also non-profit educational organizations. I use that term educational loosely, such as the National Center for Homeopathy. When you have a chance, you can Google it. I don't recommend doing it right after lunch. You may become nauseated. But so there's definitely a fair amount of support for homeopathy. And you might ask, well, why is it that people continue to use homeopathic products? Don't they understand that there's no way it could work? Well, number one, again, a lot of people don't understand even basic chemistry or basic physics. They don't get it, or they haven't been informed about it. Number two, they've tried it, and based on their experience, they think it works, right? First of all, there's the placebo effect, And then a lot of homeopathic products are used for self-limiting conditions, things like colds, headaches, etc. So, you have the, standard example, someone who's taken a homeopathic drug for a cold, and they'll say, after 5 or 6 days, I began to feel better, right? So it must work. But another thing that's really important, I think that's overlooked, is the effective marketing that homeopathic drugs use, right? And I don't know if you can read the whole chart up there. This is something put out by the National Center for Homeopathy. It's kind of a primer on homeopathy, how it's supposed to work. But I've excerpted the key phrases here. When homeopaths market their stuff, they invariably describe it as soft, gentle, natural. I love that word natural. It's a totally meaningless word, basically, but it's something, it's a buzzword that resonates with people. Because people want natural stuff. They don't want anything artificial that comes out of some test tube. They want natural. And of course, they talk about it being FDA regulated. I'm going to expand on that in a moment, what that means. Another thing they use, this is actually from a package of oscillococcinum. It's one of the best-selling homeopathic remedies put out by the company Boiron, which is a homeopathic giant. And I think you can see it says on there, no side effects, no drug interactions, right? And that's absolutely true. There are no side effects because it has no direct effects either, right? But it gives them a huge advantage. Because first of all, when these things are sold, it's not like if you go into a drugstore, there's a special section that says, conventional medicine, and then over here it says homeopathic junk. No, they're sold right next to each other. So the uninformed consumer thinks, oh, this stuff must work like, a NyQuil or something else. But then if they look at the NyQuil, they'll see the package says, well, don't use it if you have glaucoma, hypertension, if you use MAO inhibitors, whatever. And they look at this and say, wow, I can have anything. I can still use this because it has no side effects. So they have a tremendous marketing advantage. So, for all these reasons, robust demand, misleading marketing, and lack of effective government regulation, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, actually makes homeopathy a very hard and resilient target. Now, what about this thing? What about FDA regulation? Because they advertise that it's FDA regulated. You'll see that on a number of packages, right? Well, it is true that homeopathic drugs fall within the purview of the FDA. So when people see that, the ordinary consumer, they think it means, okay, the FDA has ensured these drugs have been tested to see that they're safe and effective, just like they do for any other drug. Wrong. The FDA does not, never has tested any homeopathic drug or required the homeopathic manufacturers to test their drugs to see if they actually work. Now, there are very complicated reasons for that, including the history of the original Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, one of whose primary sponsors was a homeopathic physician. So there are actually special provisions in the original FDA Act that deal with homeopathy. Essentially, all the FDA does, at least to date, is require that a homeopathic drug be labeled as such and that it be prepared in accordance with what's called the homeopathic pharmacopoeia, which is the list of ingredients approved by the homeopathic industry. And if it has that, basically the FDA says, fine, you can go ahead and market that. The FDA does intervene from time to time when it perceives there's actually a significant threat to human health, because sometimes, in fact, homeopathic manufacturers will include something that's not in the homeopathic pharmacopoeia. There was the issue of Zicam a few years ago that contained zinc. There was just a very recent incident with Highland's teething tablets. You may have heard of this. FDA issued a warning letter because the teething tablets had trace amounts of belladonna, in some cases more than a trace amount. So actually a number of retailers stopped stocking it. So the FDA does intervene occasionally when they think there's really a possibility of a serious impact on health. For the most part, they give it a pass. Again, because of the history. And then secondly, the FDA's rationale is, look, we have limited resources. We have to spend a lot of time testing things that actually affect the human body. Why should we spend time, requiring manufacturers to test these things? Because we know what the results are going to be. Well, we at CFI thought, that wasn't a proper response because, in fact, millions of people are buying these things thinking they work. They don't work. And we know in many cases they're using these things not as something in addition to complementary or conventional medicine, but something in place of conventional medicine. So it is causing harm. So one of the things we did during my tenure as president and CEO was that we decided to take some action. So back in 2012, we petitioned the FDA for tighter regulation of homeopathic products, basically saying, look, you should hold these drugs to the same standard you hold other drugs. In other words, they have to prove they're effective, or at a minimum, if you're not going to do that, their packages should be labeled to indicate in big, bold letters, not tested by the FDA for effectiveness. And I'm happy to say that in 2015, the FDA, for the first time in decades, decided to hold public hearings on whether or not they should tighten their regulation. And in the same year, the FTC, which has jurisdiction over the advertising of products, so how homeopathic products are advertised, for example, on the web and elsewhere, they also decided to hold hearings to see if, in fact, regulation should be tightened. So we submitted comments to both agencies. Michael Dodora, who is the head of our Office of Public Policy, testified at the hearing the FDA held. And that hearing was interesting because, again, it indicates the importance of the role of skeptic organizations because we're picking up the slack where, a lot of scientists, it's not that they think homeopathy works, but they may not be that interested in it as an issue because, you're not going to get a Nobel Prize by doing research to show that sugar tablets don't work, right? So you're not going to spend your time on it. So we have to work on these issues. FDA hasn't, made a decision yet. I actually predicted at the time they probably would not make a decision until after this upcoming election because you could see how some quarters might spin it if they decided for tighter regulation. People are already saying, Obamacare has taken away your choice of doctors. FDA came down with tighter regulation. They would say, oh, look, now you can't even choose the drugs you want, right? So I think if the FDA acts, it's probably going to be next year. I'm cautiously optimistic if they don't require homeopathic manufacturers to actually prove that a product works, because that would mean the end of homeopathy, right? And that would have some serious economic impact. At a minimum, they're going to insist the packages be properly labeled to tell consumers these drugs have not been tested by the FDA. So that's just an example of something that some people might say is a soft target. It's really a hard target because there's a lot of work, and unless we take action, unless we skeptics advocate on these issues, they might be ignored. And what I say here about homeopathy applies to a whole host of other issues, including GMOs, evolution. Again, scientists accept evolution as a fact. A lot of resistance still in this country to that, especially in various public school systems. And even where there's acceptance, people don't necessarily know how to teach evolution. We're very happy that we're joining with the Richard Dawkins Foundation, which has the TIES program. It's a great program helping middle school teachers teach evolution effectively. So again, these are issues where, again, it may not be controversial among scientists. They are controversial among the public, and it's important for skeptics to step up to the plate and be advocates in this area. Okay, so that deals with controversial issues. But how about the second part of what we say skeptics do? And that is working on extraordinary claims. And what are some of these extraordinary claims? Well, they're claims about the existence of aliens, ghosts, Bigfoot, telekinesis, ESP. In other words, extraordinary entities or things about extraordinary powers. All right. Why should we focus on these claims? Because they probably don't have that much relevance, at least direct relevance to public policy. First, I probably should say the extent to which skeptics work on these claims is maybe a bit exaggerated. If you just look at the topics at this conference, for example, I think there may be only 1 or 2 sessions that deal even indirectly with these extraordinary claims. I think Joe Nickel is going to be talking a bit about his investigations. But it really doesn't really make up the majority of what we skeptics do. Nonetheless, it's undeniable that there are a number of skeptics who work on these claims and investigate these claims. Why should we do that? Well, one justification I've heard, which makes some sense, is, well, these are extraordinary claims, right? So if in fact they were true, they would have a tremendous impact on how we view the world, right? So if in fact there were proof that there were ghosts, it would totally change our understanding of death. I mean, it would indicate at least some humans survive their death in some fashion. It has pretty significant result. Same thing if there were Bigfoot, it would change our understanding completely of primate evolution. So in that sense they're important, but the reality is it's a pretty thin justification. Because as skeptics, we don't say anything with metaphysical certainty because that would make us metaphysicians. We're scientists, right? So we can't rule things out absolutely, but I think we can say it's highly, highly, highly improbable that Bigfoot is out there or that there are ghosts. So let me try another justification here. Some of you may have heard of the broken windows theory of policing, which basically holds that the police should not ignore low-level offenses like minor vandalism or loitering because it can create an atmosphere of lawlessness and lead to more serious crimes. There's actually some empirical evidence that that's correct. Unfortunately, there's also some empirical evidence that broken windows policing, as applied in some jurisdictions at least, has a disproportionate effect on minorities and the poor. So I'm not endorsing broken windows policing. So Paul Fidalgo, please don't tweet that I'm endorsing broken windows policing. I've had enough controversies already. But what I'm trying to do is draw an analogy that may provide a justification for working on extraordinary claims. First of all, just to remind everyone, there are a lot of people who believe in this stuff, right? I mean, 30 to 40% of the American population believe in ghosts, 30% believe in astrology. Bigfoot gets a little smaller support, about 15%, but those aren't negligible numbers. So there are a lot of people out there who believe this stuff. But still you might say, well, so what? So someone believes in ghosts. Does that really make that much difference? Well, the fact that they believe in Casper may in itself not make that much difference, but it's how they come to have that belief that can make a difference. Because there are studies that show that intuitive magical thinking, the type of thinking that leads people to believe in extraordinary entities, is associated with belief in a rejection of science-based reasoning in general, also with a belief in political conspiracies. Furthermore, and this is a critical point, there's some research indicating, got my slides backwards. There's some research indicating, and I have just the cover page for one recent paper, indicating that getting people to think more analytically can reduce the type of intuitive thinking that leads to belief in paranormal claims and to rejection of science. This is a recent paper by Will Gervais indicating that if you get people to think more analytically, they're more accepting of the fact of evolution. So in other words, if we want people to be more receptive to science on really important public policy matters, we can't ignore the fact that Bigfoot is breaking some windows relating to critical thinking, right? We need to inculcate critical thinking with respect to all claims, including claims in the abstract that by themselves may not seem that important, because we need to get people in the habit of using critical thinking on the really important issues. So tying these things all together, I think I can confidently say that skeptics and skeptic organizations are doing really valuable work when they investigate and evaluate both controversial and extraordinary claims. The issues we address are only soft targets in the sense that, they're not controversial among scientists, but they are nonetheless very resilient claims among the general public, both because of ideological support from commercial interests like the homeopathic industry, and also because the habits of thought of too many people lead them to indulge in intuitive and magical thinking, which can make them susceptible to accepting claims that do not have scientific support. So although believing in Casper or Sasquatch in isolation may seem kind of innocent or harmless, if we leave these claims unrebutted, if we don't teach people about the proper way to analyze some of these claims, we're going to have a lot more people believing that 9/11 was an inside job, that climate change is a hoax, that intelligent design is a proper alternative to evolution, and the government is controlled by aliens, and so forth and so on. So to sum up, and stay on time, let me say that Our work is necessary. Our work is very important. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. What you guys do here as skeptics, as activists, what our organizations do, whether it's CSI or a local or regional group, is very, very valuable and important work. We need to continue to advocate for appropriate science-based public policies, and to do that, we need to continue to educate the general public about the methodology of science and evidence-based reasoning. I know it's tough sometimes. Progress is slow, but we are making progress, and together we can make this place, this world, a better world, because more and more people will begin to understand science and apply it correctly. Thanks so much.